All right, let's get fired up. Happy Super Bowl Sunday, everyone. Thanks for joining. I do know that we went over the Cote de Beaune last week. Today's presentation follows that with the Cote de Beaune as we move a little bit further south. I think this is like the 8th presentation that we've done. We'll continue forward. I have about 40 of them put together. I just want to throw a quick shout out to my study buddy, Chris Walter, here in Houston, Texas. We compiled a lot of these while studying for Master Sommelier Theory in 2019. Neither of us were successful, but I felt like the amount of work that we put into it needed to be shared. And so hopefully some of these presentations can help people to understand the regions that we talk about a little bit better, and even not necessarily in a sense of being better for examination days, although we hope that can help there as well. But just being better on the floor of a restaurant or in a retail setting, being able to understand where these wines are from, how to understand how to read the labels to them, and what it means, where they come from. And particularly when we talk about Burgundy, right? It can be a bit daunting of a task whenever you first start as a sommelier or a buyer in a retail setting, trying to understand Burgundy. And well, hopefully we can shed some light on some things here today. So we start in the Cote de Beaune. Always like to look at the maps first. You can see the Cote de Beaune and the extension south. Here's the city of Beaune proper. And then we can see this particular map shows Grand Crus labeled in dark red, which of course are just up here and here with Corton. And then as you get into the Montrachets all the way down here. A ton of Premier Cru though in between, right? It lays on the slope. You can see, of course, the Haute Côte up here to the west, which is not protected typically by the forests. And then you see the famous highways that separate really the west and east side here. Some general history. We went over a little bit of this in Cote de Beaune, but we'll expand a bit upon it for Cote de Beaune. Here you move from the Benedictine order to the Cistercian monks to the Valois dukes. Really the death of Charles the Bold in the last year of the Burgundian Wars left the region back in the ownership of King Louis XI. Important to note, Jules Laval wrote history at Statistique de la Vigne et des Grands Vins de la Côte d'Or, which is largely considered to be the benchmark classification of Burgundy Clémence in 1855. It really birthed the AOCs in 1936 and 37. So there are original Jules Laval maps. I suggest looking for those. The Champagne book that Peter Liam wrote has some original Jules Laval Champagne book, maps. The ones for Burgundy are fantastic, and they really, really help you to understand the region. As far as phylloxera, it really strikes first in Meursault in 1878, coming from the south. It was in Morgon and Beaujolais in 1874, and prior to that, it was in the Rhone Valley. Interesting to note, Romani Conti did not replant until 1945, and they fought phylloxera with copper disulfide, which of course is very bad for soil types. It's funny to note too, and I think one thing we should always talk about with phylloxera is that you sort of read about phylloxera and think, well, okay, it strikes, and so then the vineyard dies. It actually takes quite a while for the vineyard to die, typically somewhere from 7 to 10 years. And what you see is just a smaller yield, but sometimes the fruit that is bared at the time could be much more concentrated and quite delicious. I know that I was in Oregon a few years ago at Beaufrere, and the Beaufrere vineyard was riddled with phylloxera, but the fruit was really, really delicious. And they were sort of at that point where they were making a decision, okay, are we at the point, the event horizon, so to speak, with the vineyard where we can no longer produce the quantity that we need, but the quality is still fantastic. You start to see the Guillot method as far as vine training replacing Provenage by Dr. Jules Guillot in the 1860s. Provenage is sort of an antiquated vine training method, otherwise known as tip layering. It's still utilized in the production of Bollinger's Vieux Vin à la Française in Champagne. And it's a method where you take the vine and literally layer it by the tip of the vine back down into the ground. And so you're keeping the same vine growing year after year. You start to see coupage outlawed in 1919. This is essentially labeling based on taste, right? So it's sort of like what port does, right? Okay, this is this tastes like a Volnay. So we're going to call it Volnay. And that's what coupage was, regardless of where the fruit actually came from. Those began to be outlawed in 1919. The Hospices de Beaune, we noted the creation of the Hotel Dieu by Nicolas Roy in 1443 and the Cote de Beaune presentation, but of course we want to get a little more in depth with that as we're actually in Beaune here. So operated until 1971 when the Hospices de Beaune was created under the Hotel Dieu. They own about 60 hectares as a whole. There's 20 in Beaune, 8 in Meursault, and then there's a smattering of others around. You see a total of 8 Grand Cru vineyards represented. The wine auction actually started in 1859. It continues today. And here you see dozens of cuvées that are produced from parcels that are donated after the name of the donator or the person of their choice. So you'll see quite a few of them that are named after doctors or people that were, potentially landowners. The wines are purchased by barrel and then they're finished at the winery they're labeled with. So prior to 2005, only Burgundy producers could participate. Now it's kind of open to anyone, which is strange to me. I mean, I can't say that I expect to see a Silver Oak Hospices de Beaune, but I think it would be super cool if you did see some people that were not from Burgundy participating. As far as the climate is concerned, really continental to semi-continental here. The last true frost vintage was 1985. You see hail in 2012, 13, and 14 in Beaune, and 2010 in Chablis. Of course, netting is not legal here, which led us to smudge pots and aspersion back in the 1950s and 60s. Today, there's several different techniques that you can use, but of course, the hail has been a big issue in the last decade. Local cuisine, similar to what we talked about before, in fact, exactly the same. The Charolais beef, the poulet de Bresse, époisse, and then that other cheese that I could never pronounce correctly, chaus. As far as aspect and geography, very much the same slide that we looked at with Cote de Beaune, but just a refresh. Of course, the Côte d'Or means the golden slope. Here you have eastern-facing slopes. The Cote de Beaune generally turns a bit and faces a little more southeast. You're at about 400 to 500 meters in elevation. Your Grand Crus are typically at less than 10% of a slope. Within those, you've got combs, which are sort of dry, transverse valleys. They serve as a conduit for the cold breezes and unfortunately for hail as well. You see alluvial fans of pebble and stone at the mouth that diversifies their soil types. And again, the average domain in the Côte d'Or as a whole is about 18.5 acres. Burgundy lies along an exposed fault line, decomposed shellfish, rich in calcium that dots the landscape. You see the limestone escarpment as you begin to move up the slope, and then above that, you'll find marl stone. There's a little silt and scree just above the marl where the best wines are typically made. As far as grapes in the region, well, we know Pinot Noir, of course, is the king, once referred to as Morillon and Norien. Pinot first appeared as a name in the late 14th century in Burgundy, and about a third of the vineyard's plantings are Burgundy. But still, Chardonnay is the most planted grape in all of Burgundy. Aligote, which shares a parentage with Chardonnay, which is Pinot and Gouais Blanc. And I put some other progenies here, too, to understand what Pinot and Gouais Blanc has produced. Of course, Chardonnay, Aligote, Gamay, Saucy, and Melon de Bourgogne. And I think it's important. I think I've heard people say, well, Pinot and Gouais Blanc produce a Chardonnay. Must be an only child then, because it can have certain other children too, and that's exactly what this case has. Annually, production for Burgundy as a whole is 62% white, 31% red and rosé, and then there's a small remainder that is sparkling wine. As far as grapes are concerned, an interesting note, the Dijon clone originated in Ponceau's Clos de la Roche vineyard, which was created by Raymond Bernard. Viticultural techniques. Planting density and yield restrictions certainly tighten as you scale that quality pyramid. The Premier Cru typically has lower yields. En foule, otherwise known as in a crowd, and I'm sure I butchered that pronunciation, and Provenage, have sort of given way to that single guillote, the Côte d'Or. The double is pretty rarely seen, but it's prevalent up in Chablis with the Cordon de Royat. Beaujolais is far more likely to be Gobelets trained, right? Most rows here are east-west up the slope rather than parallel to it, although some notable exceptions are Clos de Tart, Clos de Lambray, and La Romanée. Typically about 9,000 plants per hectare are required. Usually they're 1 by 1 meter spaced. Low train, typically a ½ meter to allow for mechanization of the overhead tractors that come through. Wrong way, pardon me. I wanted to bring up biodynamic techniques for Burgundy. Really, the first was Jean-Claude Rasteau in 1979. Others that you see that fall in line: Domaine Leroy, Domaine de la Romanée-Conti, Domaine Laflave, Vincent Dovissat, Comte Lafon, and Comte d'Armand. So truly, some of the greatest producers in Burgundy have adopted the biodynamic processes. Viticulture, too, as far as disease and pestilence, this is something that's really been an issue in Burgundy. You see fungal disease running rampant in 2007, 11, and 12. The ladybugs we talked about with pyrazines as a pheromone in 2004 and somewhat in 2011, though really that 04 vintage is known for that. Flavescence, Doré, most harmful currently, 11 caused serious concern. And then we mentioned before using smudge pots and aspersion to help combat frost in the 50s and 60s. As far as vinification is concerned, the typical Burgundy barrel is really the 228-liter piece. Malo, of course, very common. And I think that's just more of a byproduct of no one doing anything to stop it. They just allow it to occur. Cold maceration is a technique adopted by Henri Jaillet, and we spoke quite a bit about him when we talked about our Crow Parent 2 in the last presentation. It's really loved by Jean Griveaux and, of course, hated by Dujac. This occurs before fermentation. Really, about 5 to 7 days can be normal, but it can last for weeks, and it can provide more aromatics and intensity of color to the finished wine. Henri Jaillet also famously practiced total destemming, so grapes only going through. On the other side of that spectrum, you find Domaine de la Romanée-Conti and most famously Dujac for a whole cluster, depending on the site and the warmth of the vintage. This provides cooler fermentation temperatures, lighter color, firmer tannins, right? So you could sort of see the opposite ends of what they're trying to make. We talk about more aromatics and deeper color coming from cold maceration and destemming, whereas you see a lighter color but more firm tannins here coming from whole cluster. You can also add, those stems can add a little bit of potassium, which raises the pH of the wine and, of course, lowers the acidity to it. As far as vinification techniques continue, chaptalization is quite common. Here it's a lot of times using white beet sugar. You'll also see subtractive must enrichment, which was legalized in 2009. This allows the winemaker to remove up to 10% water from the must concentrate, so really concentrating down that juice again. Acidification is legal, though technically it's illegal to chaptalize and acidify one wine. I just think nobody really cares. They kind of do it on their own. Famously, Pierre-Yves Colin-Moret and Henri Boyot used 350-liter barrels for their whites, so a little less impactful than what you see from the 228-liter piece. Some terminology, I think we touched on this before, but Premier Cru is not a designated class of AOP. It's just a defined geographic designation for village, or the villages. Here's a handful of Ludites approved in 1990 as geographical designations for Bourgogne AOP listed here: La Chapelle Notre Dame, La Chapitre, Côte Saint-Jacques, and Montrecule. And then, of course, the top Haute-Côte de Beaune regions to the west: Marie-le-Fissé, Magny-le-Villers, Villars-Montaigne, and Bevy. Cote de Beaune village wines are always red, interesting, but they may not be sourced from Pommard, Volnay, Alox-Corton, or Beaune. In the case of Cote de Nuit village wines, they can be red or white, and they can come from Fixen and Brochon in the north, Prissy, Courgalogne, and Comblachon in the south. And I noted before we talked about fermage and métayage, and I wanted to bring some light to those things. Fermage, or the tenant basically leases, right? So in this case, DRC leases 3 parcels in the Corton, right? So they pay cash to lease the land. And then métayage is sharecropping. So Roumier produces Rochot Chambertin, but it's owned by Michel Bonifant, and they share that. Some terminology I think is important to note when you look at Burgundy. just in general. These are some label terms that you'll find that come up. Chevettes, which are water channels. Merget, which is a pile of rock removed from vineyards during tilling. Dent de chêne, which is dog teeth. Moine, which is monk. You see a lot of religious things here. Chapitre is religious chapter. Chapelle is a chapel. Prior is a priory. Abbé is abbey, right? Kliman is from the Greek term klima, which means incline and exposure to the sun. Charme and chaume, which can be interchangeable, really is fallow scrubland, but so plowed but not used, right? Père is father, and et fille is sons and sons. And then another interesting one, and I saw somebody on a Burgundy page yesterday with questions about Perrier and how there's so many different Perrier. Perrier and Carrier are actually synonymous with quarry, or an area that's been dug out, essentially, which is a ton of places throughout Burgundy. And that's why you'll find a Perrier Premier Cru in just about every region of Burgundy. I went ahead and threw in that pyramid just to showcase what I think we need to pay attention to with the 4-tier hierarchy. You see regional, commune or village, Premier Cru, which is just a handful of percentage, 9 to 10% here. And then Grand Cru is at top 1 to 2%. With monopole Grand Cru AOP, you have to hand harvest. There's 2 regional IGPs, the Cote de Beaune, which does not overlap an AOP, north and west, and then a Sainte-Marie-la-Blanche to the east, although technically no IGP covers the Côte d'Or region as a whole. And now for the meat and potatoes. So we kind of got the generic stuff out of the way, and now we're going to take a look at some maps. We'll start in the north and move our way all the way south. Probably as we get further south, we're going to run into the more quality regions, but I think it's important to take a look at them all. So we start really with the Grand Cru in the north of the Cote de Beaune, and that's Courton, right, and the hill of Courton, which includes Courton, Les Courtons here, Charlemagne on Charlemagne. So you'll find Grand Crus that are labeled as Courton, Courton Charlemagne, and very little just Charlemagne. These are typically the least expensive and lowest quality of Grand Crus, so it's a great way to kind of get your entry level if you just want to check that box. Le Doigt-Serigny here to the east, Alox Courton, which of course is here, and then Pernin Vergilus to the northwest. All include slices of the Grand Cru and encircle the southern portion. About 75% of it, though, you can see lies within Alox Courton here, and really at the heart of it, Le Croix, Les Renards, and Les Bressans are the best sites right through here. Le Charlemagne is in Alox Courton, and then you'll find on Charlemagne and Pernin Vergilus. And this is really the core of Courton Charlemagne. About 72 of the 160 hectares are within Courton Charlemagne, and the largest landowner here is Louis Latour. And we'll come back and take a look at Pernin Vergilus here in just a second, but I'd like to show the hill of Courton in all of its grace and beauty, so you can kind of see exactly what it looks like there. Just to the east here is La Doigt-Serigny, and you can see Alox Courton here and Pernin Vergilus, and I want to point out that north is this way, right? So here's Le Doigt-Serigny, and you can see Le Rognette et Courton is really the top blue deep, sort of an unofficial designation. The Premier Crus labeled under Alox Courton that you'll find that cross the border, Le Coutier, Le Maréchal, and Le Taupe Vert, and Le Petit Laurier, and probably most importantly, Le Taupe Vert there. This name for Le Doigt-Serigny is pretty interesting to note. By the way, here's Le Taupe Vert, Le Maréchal, and Clos de Maréchal. Interesting, this comes from 2 different hamlets, and it's not a vineyard within a region. So Le Doigt is a hamlet, Serigny is a region, or excuse me, is a hamlet, and those 2 come together. And a hamlet, I should note again, is like a village, basically, or a small town. Back to that same map that we looked at before for Pernin Vergilus. Here you'll find the Fertile Hill. In the southwest is mostly red, and the northeast, by law, can only be white. And you'll find here the Sous Fertile, Clos Berthet, and the village de Pernon right here. That's elevated to Premier Cru for the 2000 vintage, typically more dense tannin here. Your top producers are Rollin, Dubril Fontaine, Pierre Marais, Rappé, and the famous Bonneau de Martray. In the Sauvignon Le Bon, you can see here is further west from this general map. We'll get a little bit more broken down into it here. You can also see this stream that kind of cuts it right in half, and that's the Roine stream. About 300 to 350 hectare here, Pinot Noir. They tend to be very light and pure if you think of almost haute côte style. Top producers are Simon Bies and Chandon de Briey. On the other side, you'll find Choret-le Bon, on the other side of the highway here, with just a little exception that cuts out. There's no slope, there's no Premier Cruz. There's a couple of great producers in Toyot-Bout and Domaine Germain. All in all, your quality wines typically come from Sauvignon Le Bon over Choret. And it sort of keeps with the tendency of things on the western side of the highway, right? So we'll back out again. We'll turn off the kaleidoscope and get into Beaune and Cote de Beaune AOPs. This is really, Beaune has the most land planted in the Cote de Beaune. Great negociants here. You'll find Jadot, Bouchard, Patriarche, Chanson, Drouhin, and of course Drouhin's Clos de Mouchy Blanc is produced here. There's 42 Premier Crus in Beaune. The top Premier Crus are Le Bresson, Le Grave, which of course is home to the famous L'Enfant Jésus and Le Touron. And it sits within the Montagne de Beaune and the Montagne Saint-Désir. The Cote de Beaune and Cote de Beaune Village are separate AOPs, and that should be noted. Oh, and one thing I wanted to point out, of course, we looked at Corton up here. We'll get to more of these Grand Crus down, but this is a cool way to look at Chevalier Montrachet, Montrachet, Criot Batard Montrachet, Batard Montrachet, and Bienvenue Batard Montrachet. So if you could remember, the Batards are on the right. Perfect. But before we get all the way to the south, we start again in the north. The northernmost area here is Pommard, really for red wine only. Typically denser, more tannic style traditionally. There's a stream that bisects it, and that's the Douin stream that keeps it into sort of a western region and eastern region. A lot of the water flow that came from that erosion have deposited iron-rich clays, opposed to Volnay. So here your best domains are Comte-Armand and Domaine de Courcelles. Your top Premier Crus are down here. You'll find Le Grand Epinot, Le Petit Epinot, and Clos d'Epinot. And Clos d'Epinot is the Comte-Armand monopole that's sort of divided between the two. On the west bank, you'll find Le Rougienne Basse and Haute. Rougienne Basse is typically preferred to the Haute because it's a little steeper on the Haute. Both were included in a petition for Grand Cru in 2011. As we get further south, you'll find Volnay. Again, red wine only, just like Pommard here, its neighbor. But these are a bit more elegant of a style than Pommard. The Capetian Dukes gave a lot of these Premier Crus their names. Your top domains here include Marquis d'Angerville, Hubert de Monty, Michel Lafarge, Henri Boyot, and Domaine de la Pousse d'Or. About 120 to 205 hectare, you can see, are dominated by Premier Cru, right? And your best Premier Cru are Cailloret, En Champagne, Clos de Chêne, and Taille-Pied, right here in this bunch. Here, Meursault producers, which is just south, can label the following as Volnay Saint-Aubin Premier Cru if they're red. Le Saint-Aubin du Milieu, Le Saint-Aubin Blanc, Le Purée, and Le Saint-Aubin du Sud. And you'll see some of those as we move forward. And about a third of the Premier Crus in Volnay are monopoles. So things like Clos de Château de Duc, Clos de la Cave de Duc, Clos de Duc, those are famous questions that come up in exam settings. Name 2 monopoles Premier Cru of Volnay. You should be ready to jump on that. Montpellier, as you can see, we're just south of Volnay, kind of in between Meursault, Volnay, and Alchy de Retz. Here, not a ton, but there's a few Premier Crus. The top one is Les Champs Fouillettes and Sur-Level. And Sur-Level is probably the best one just because it backs right up to Volnay. And it borders Clos de Chêne. Alchy de Retz, more of the same. The Rio de Clos bisects the AOP. Sits between the hills of Montmelin and Bourdon. Sort of lacks the protection of the Côte, so you get cooler winds and more hailstorms that plague the region. There are 9 Premier Crus. The top sites are Climat Duval here, Clos de Val within Clos de Val, Climat Duval. It's basically a 1 hectare plot within that. It's a clos. White wines are about a third of the production. Your top domains here are Moulin à Moine, which we mentioned, that's a monk, right? Prunier d'Amy and oddly enough, Maison Leroy. And following in that trend, as we get further south there to Saint-Romain, you'll find just northwest of Auchy de Retz, higher elevation, truly just an extension of the Haute Cote de Beaune here. Chardonnay's dominant, about 2-to-1, less than 100 hectare. Top producer is really Domaine d'Alvenay, which is owned by Lalou Bise Leroy, although they don't actually produce Saint-Romain wines. And now we start to get into the real tenderloin again here, Meursault, okay? About 400 hectare, it's dominated by white wines. You can see it's truly separated almost north and south. The lower water table provides more extensive cellars, so some say this is the purpose of the oxidative style. They have a tendency to spend more time in oak because they have more bigger cellars, basically. The top producers, of course, in Meursault, this is a laundry list of the most famous wines out there, right? Coche de Riz, Guy Rouleau, Comte Lafon, Patrick Javillier, Jacques Prière, Pierre Moret. Excuse me. Your most important Clément is Le Perrier. Imagine that. But the Le Perrier in Meursault also includes Albert Griveau's Clos de Perrier, which is pretty critical, and you'll find that right over here. It abuts two others that are pretty important, Le Charme and Le Genévrier, and you can see they're sort of split here. All of these sit below 300 meters on the hillside south of town. So alongside Port-au-Saut and Le Goutte d'Or, which you'll find here. So Premier Cru are only about 25% of the land, you'll notice here. Other important lieu dites within, you'll find Clos de la Barre, which is, of course, Comte Lafon, Le Tesson, Le Tillet, Le Narvaux, and Charme de Narvaux. As we get down into Puligny and Blagny, about 3.4 hectares planted as of 2012 for red, and there's 211 hectare for white. So really, white wines are dominant here, and they're released as Puligny, Montrachet, and Meursault. And then the red wines are released as Blagny. And these are delicious red wines, by the way, if you get an opportunity to drink them. There's 4 Premier Cru in Meursault and 3 in Puligny Montrachet. The shared Grand Crus between the two. Here, shared Grand Crus, for Puligny Montrachet and Chassagne and Montrachet and Batard Montrachet. There is a sole Grand Cru, and that's, there are 2 sole Grand Crus, and those are Bienvenue and Chevalier. And you'll see those listed here. Chevalier Montrachet here, Bienvenue, Batard Montrachet listed here. And then the 2 shared in between are Montrachet and Batard Montrachet. And you'll see as we get to Chassagne where they kind of overlap. Really, Montrachet, 8 hectares shared by 16 owners. Like most of the great Grand Crus of the Côte d'Or, it sits in that 250 to 270 meter range. The Montrachet shields it from the cold winds. Batard and Bienvenue sit lower and have a deeper soil, creating sort of a fatter style of wine. Chevalier sits above Montrachet on thinner soil and creates edgier styles, but really great balance. 17 Premier Crus, they all sit in the north up here. The best sites adjoin Grand Crus, right? So Le Demoiselle, within Le Cailleret, which is here. Champ Canet and Le Combet, which you'll find, Champ Canet right here and Le Combet, and they abut Meursault, essentially. And I think it's also important for Blagny, Sous le Puy is a fantastic site for production of red wines. And then you'll find, again, Clavillon here, which is another important one you'll see on Premier Cru labels. Le Perrier, hey, imagine that. Champagne up here. Beautiful wines. So a few more facts about Puligny Montrachet. Jadot and Latour produced Chevalier Montrachet Le Cailleret, which is a 1939 addition to the Grand Cru. Your largest Cléments are Le Foletier and Champagne. Your top producers here, Domaine Laflave, Carillon, Salzay, and Pernod. Laflave has the largest ownership of Bienvenue, Batard Montrachet, and Batard Montrachet. And then Marquis de Laguiche owns 2 hectares of Montrachet, which is 25% of it, and produced and marketed by Drouin. And then Bouchard owns the largest portion of Chevalier, almost a third of it, including a parcel, known as Cuvée la Cabote, from a lieu dit once included in Montrachet. So that's important to note too. Chassagne, as you see, we get a little bit further to the south here. And there's some important things that we'll note too. You'll see Puligny here in Saint-Aubin. There's some famous en Ramilly. We'll get to that in just a second with Saint-Aubin. But here you'll find Les Montrachet on the Chassagne side. You'll find half of Batard, and you'll find all of Criots, which is the smallest wine-producing Grand Cru in Burgundy, smallest white-producing wine in Burgundy. Red clay soils, traditionally red wine until World War II. The top sites are Morgiot, Clos Saint-Jean, and Clos Pitois. 200 to 300 hectares are now planted to white. Premier Crus kind of sit on limestone-derived soils, and you can see they sort of cut through right here. Typically thicker and broader than what you find in Puligny Montrachet. I also have a tendency to find a bit more tropical fruit, I think, on these. There's 55 Premier Cru. Morgiot has 15 Premier Cru within it. Kyret actually houses 4 Premier Cru. Blanc de Sceaux is really the #1 Premier Cru of all, though, because it really abuts right up next to Le Montrachet. Your top producers, Ramenet, and then Pierre-Yves Collin-Moret. And of course, there's lots of Collins, Morets, and Gagnards scattered throughout the entire thing. Interesting enough. Then as we get to Saint-Aubin, and I think I pointed out earlier, you can see Chassagne and Montrachet here, and Puligny Montrachet, and then abutting Montrachet is en Ramilly, and really a hidden gem. You also find the Bergère de Dantachon. It's really tucked in a cool little valley, mostly white wine and mostly Premier Cru, to be honest with you. You know, we said that shouting distance within Chevalier Montrachet for en Ramilly, but faces south rather than east. The middle section has the same elevation and soil type as Chevalier. So your best Premier Crus, we mentioned, en Ramilly, Les Bergères de Dantachon, also Les Châtaigniers, important to note. Best producers here, Hubert Lamy, Marc Collin, and Henri Prudhomme. Then we get into Santenay and Morange. You sort of see the hillsides shift due south here. You'll find a little shift in this. Here's Chassagne Montrachet, to the northeast. Montassin is the highest point in the Cote de Beaune. It's the 4th largest production of the Cote de Beaune, is 80% red wine. The Laval classification actually had Clos de Tavannes and Noyer Bart, both within Le Gravier Premier Cru today. The best vineyards from the Chassagne side. So over on this area. Key producers here are Roger Bellon and Lucien Mazard. The Morange area has 7 Premier Crus, including Le Foussier, which sort of sits in that 240 to 400 meter elevation right here. It's kind of the highest in the Cote de Beaune. Great producers there, Edmond Monod and Chevreau. About 5 to 10% white wines are produced under AOP here. I think it's always important to note negociant producers and different styles of producers in the area, particularly for Burgundy. So the largest in the Côte d'Or is Bouchard, followed by Drouhin, and then Jadot. Your micro-negociants, of course, Dujac, Dumonty, and Benjamin Leroux, famously of Comte Armand. Maison Champy and Maison Claude Marais were really the first negociant houses founded in 1720. Bouchard came online in 1731. And still, about 60% of sales of Burgundy are negociant. And then this is the same map that I showed you before, but these are recent vintages since the 2000. You know, I hate to give people a vintage chart. I really like to hear people's opinions about them because I love 2002s and 2008s. They're a bit leaner. Again, pay attention to that 04 vintage with the meaty greenies. But yeah, phenomenal wines, and hopefully this presentation helped bring some understanding to the Cote de Beaune and some different regions within it. If anybody has any questions, feel free to send them to me via email. I'd love to hear them, love to hear about your studies. But that's my presentation for today. I hope everybody has a wonderful Super Bowl Sunday. Enjoy yourselves, and I'll see you next week for class again.